Shore duty.
Good morning, Captain. Sorry I missed you at dinner last night.
You had me a little worried before you called. The flight lasted longer than you expected?
Yes, I found several strong thermals, so I tried my hand at soaring with a Cub.
Good for you. Piper Cubs made fairly good training gliders during World War II. Army glider pilots were trained in similar airplanes, converted to gliders, by having their engines replaced with weight and a skid in place of landing gear. In fact, their glide ratio was better than the CG-4A troop gliders flown in Europe. So, how'd you do?
Not bad, I guess, for a beginner. The cloud bases were nearly 7,000 feet, and I managed to center several thermals at around 2,000 feet, throttle back to idle, and ride right up to 6,000 feet, climbing at better than 500 feet a minute. It was so much fun the time whizzed by. It was nearly sunset when the lift died, or I might still be up there.
That's wonderful, Mike. You could have shut down the engine.
I thought about it, but it isn't my airplane, and I was too far from an airfield if the engine didn't restart.
Yes, Sam's a patient man, all right, and he has been extremely generous in leaving his Cub over here for you. But an off-field landing, after intentionally shutting down the engine, would have been difficult news to deliver. There's rain in the forecast, so shall we convene on the porch after breakfast and catch up on passing through?
Sounds good.
So, where were we, Mike?
September 1960. You had just returned from the Ticonderoga cruise.
Ah, yes, and a new training cycle with new people to prepare for the next cruise.
But weren't you supposed to return to shore duty in VF-121 as an instructor and LSO in time to fly the first Phantoms?
Yes, but the air wing was facing an unusually quick turnaround for another cruise aboard Ticonderoga. Despite my best efforts at training squadron LSOs, I hadn't made myself dispensable. So I agreed to remain for a few more months through the operational readiness inspection off Hawaii. Besides, fleet introduction of the Phantom had been delayed, and I was having fun flying with the F-53, so there was no urgent rush to get back to VF-121.
Were there many new pilots coming into VF-53?
No, that was another good thing. Nearly all the pukin dogs were turning around for the next cruise. The greatest challenge was that VF-51 was transitioning to F-8U Crusaders. Everyone was new to the squadron from the CO down, and early omens were that it was to be the worst squadron I ever knew. The new CO's ensign wingman retracted his landing gear and flaps too soon after takeoff on a hot day in Yuma and settled back onto the runway, sliding off the end on the Crusader's belly at better than 100 knots, so the ensign ejected. At that time, Crusaders did not have ground-level ejection seats, so the pilot came down still in the seat with the chute streaming unopened. When the crash crew and ambulance with several squadron mates arrived on scene, they were astonished to find the pilot standing and taking off his parachute harness. Miraculously, he seemed to be uninjured except for speaking gibberish and not recognizing anyone. Shortly after delivering him to the hospital, however, the ensign died of internal bleeding from a broken pelvis.
Wow, quite a beginning for that CO's commit.
It got worse. A few months later, flying back to Ticonderoga, offshore San Diego, one clear afternoon, still over 30 miles away, I saw thick smoke rising from the flight deck. My heart sank with the realization that there had been a crash. It was the CO's second ensign wingman. He had settled far below the glide path, close in. The LSO waved him off, but it was too late. The Crusader struck the round down so low that his main landing gear didn't even get to the flight deck. The Crusader, what was left of it, came to a stop in the arresting gear, with the left wing broken off and the remaining half of the fuselage laying on its left side on fire. Crusaders were largely made of magnesium, which burns like a flare when ignited. So in 3 frames of the 35mm crash film, the upwind right wingtip went from no fire to melt. The crash crew was quick to get the hoses to the scene, but the foam generators malfunctioned for some time before they were able to get the pilot out of the fire, which was so intense it melted the ensign's helmet visor. Though his oxygen mask and Nomex gloves and flight suit did a credible job of protecting him, a burning piece of magnesium penetrated his inside left thigh. Amazingly, 2 days later, Ensign number 2 was taken off the critical list at Balboa Naval Hospital and was well enough to sit up in bed and visit with his squadron mates. But that night, he died of a staph infection.
What a shame. I see you numbered the CO's ensigns. So there's a story about ensign number 3 coming?
Correct, Mike. Ensign number 3 had a lot of catching up to do before the imminent deployment date, including qualification carrier landings. As was customary, we had the usual Dependence Day cruise, with the wives and parents invited to spend a day at sea serving flight operations. Of course, the best place for an LSO's wife to see carrier landings up close and get an appreciation for hubby's collateral job was with him on the LSO platform.
Wasn't that considered dangerous? Weren't flight deck personnel getting hazardous duty pay?
Yeah, except not for LSOs, since we were already on flight bay. We just took the wives along without asking, and no one said anything about it. On those small World War II vintage carrier decks, the LSO platform was quite close to the landing area, even with the platform extended out over deck edge 60 feet above the ocean. The only escape route off the flight deck was a mesh wire safety net with mattresses below the platform to jump into, leading to a hatch on the deck below. I'd say that our thinking was that if it was okay for LSOs to be there day and night in weather fair or foul, it seemed worth the risk to have our wives share the experience to gain perspective. Otherwise, I found that mothers raising children tended to see life through kitchen windows with their children's outlook, which sometimes lead to uninformed judgments and unrealistic expectations about the world.
Why not just say bitchy and demanding? Isn't that what you mean, Captain?
I'd rather not be quoted that way, but if you're going to tell this tale as our conversation, then you can quote yourself. Anyhow, back to the LSO platform. It was the usual calm offshore San Diego day with light wind and smooth seas. Everything was going well until the Crusader approaching the ramp suddenly went very low. I immediately triggered the wave-off lights, backed up forcefully on the radio. Even the wives could see that the Crusader was in deep trouble, and they led the way, clearing the platform, jumping into the net and running through the hatch. Fortunately, the Crusader cleared the ramp by inches.
I presume that the pilot was ensign number 3?
Of course. The CO decided to spice up the Dependence Day cruise by putting up his unqualified and most inexperienced pilot, flying Navy's most demanding carrier airplane, without telling us, because he knew damn well what my response would have been. I gave him hell after the recovery.
A commander CO had to get permission from a lieutenant LSO and then take a lot of disrespect for not doing it?
Not disrespect, Mike. LSOs are key players with the giant responsibility and authority for safe carrier landings, and no one else can do that job for him. The LSO's authority necessarily transcends rank, especially in cases of colossal stupidity which endangers the ship and crew.
That's a pretty heavy load for a junior officer, isn't it?
That's what I liked about it.
What was Orly's reaction to the excitement?
Nothing. She didn't mention it, so I let it pass. Orly had little interest in the Navy or my flying. She had little appreciation for what I was doing and did not socialize with squadron-wise functions unless they were command performances. At the time, I chalked it up to having her time taken up with raising the kids, and I figured that was just the way it was with women. My mother was the same way about my flying. She persisted in telling everyone I was a bomber pilot until I threatened to tell folks that she was a retired hooker who had worked every whorehouse from Singapore to Calcutta.
I can see how that would do it. So you got through the Hawaii inspection okay and returned to VF 121?
There was just one more incident to talk about. You remember that the Puke and Dog operations officer?
The aggressive, overconfident, marginally talented pilot with a negative attitude toward LSOs?
That's him. Gib Kirk's carrier landings were too often damn dangerous. One day, after a very close call, I lost my temper and reamed his ass out in the ready room before all, telling him he was going to kill himself. The only time I said anything like that to anyone. I should have grounded him.
Because
Later in the cruise, he fulfilled my prophecy one night by hitting the ramp and going over the side, leaving his wife and 6 children behind because of his inflated ego and stubborn defiance.
surely you didn't blame yourself. You weren't there. And as you said, the pilot is the one ultimately responsible for flying his aircraft, right?
Mostly correct. Still, I saw it coming. I should have had the guts to prevent it.
How were you affected?
Good question, Mike. Remember the old commander I met in flight training when a classmate was killed, who wept when he recalled all the friends he lost to crashes? Well, that was me. The odd thing is, though, of all the aviation fatalities I was near throughout my career, that was the only loss I took personally. To this day, I choke up recalling that event. For all his shortcomings as an aviator, Gib was a strong leader and a good administrator, which was just what VF-53 Puke and Dogs needed in the absence of those qualities in the CO and XO. Gib was a role model and mentor to me. Perhaps the most professionally valuable lesson was how to write clear, brief, and concise Navy messages with spare use of adjectives to emphasize important points. To appear busy in the CAG office between landing recoveries, I took to practice by typing letters home on message forms.
How did Orly respond to that?
No differently than to other letters. Sometimes I wondered if she read them, but there was such a long period between sending and receiving that I usually forgot what I had written. It's hard to connect when the time and distance is so great, and there's little common ground.
Women often save letters from their men, didn't Orly?
I don't think so. I saved hers to reread periodically until the end of the cruise, and then tossed them. As I said, some of my letters toward the end of cruises were more romantic, but nothing of literary value.
I imagine the Navy message style didn't exactly enhance love letters.
No doubt, Mike. Yet even in Navy format, some of my letters were more flowery, romantic than Orly's.
As you say, she had other dogs to pet?
Yes, I assume so. After all, we didn't have much time together at home. Why should she warm up to me when I was 8,000 of miles away for 7 months?
There must have been some quality time between you. Didn't your youngest Sky come along during this shore duty tour?
True. When I came home from work one day, Orly simply said, "Guess what? I'm pregnant." The exact same words your mother used in 1955 to announce your happy event. It doesn't take very much quality time to produce pregnancies, does it, Mike?
Touché, Captain. It surely does not.
That is not to say that I did not enjoy being a father. I did. For the time I had, I don't think I was all that bad at it either. Fortunately, the noise level doesn't go up much after 2 kids, partly because of Aurelie's hands-off parenting philosophy. They relied on each other a lot and got along beautifully. In fact, they were so close that when we took them out, they remained tightly together. Once, for example, when we drove up into the mountains to a beautiful panoramic clearing near the woods for a picnic, the 4 of them remained huddled. It was the same joined-at-the-hip behavior at places like the zoo. They truly loved each other, especially David and Christopher. Since the boys were only 10 months apart and were such close playmates, they were sometimes assumed to be twins. Sky was a wonder, a totally self-sufficient angel from Cloud 9, viewed with admiring awe by her family. Jennifer was distinctly different. My sense of her was that she was directly linked to my mother. From the beginning, Jenny did not see eye to eye with Aurelie's relaxed housekeeping habits and tended to be somewhat critical and bossy, a trait which magnified with age. Still, all was amazingly tranquil at the Souza home, largely attributable to Aurelie's philosophy that the prime aspect of parenting was to let your children know that you love them. It's fortunate that it worked for her, because she otherwise had little interest in mundane household tasks like cooking or cleaning. The kids' appearance resembled ragamuffin orphans, and they often had to fend for themselves. One morning I found that Sky, who had only just learned to walk, had climbed a kitchen counter and was reaching to a high cabinet shelf to get a box of cereal down for her breakfast. Obviously, that was not the first time.
Did that bother you much?
No, I wasn't home enough to warrant interference, and I was satisfied that the children were happy and healthy. I had been quickly infused with Navy's management emphasis on results, not the manner in which results were achieved. Give people all the authority needed to carry out their responsibilities.
Your experience as an LSO was a good example of that.
Yes, indeed, and typical of the Navy way from top to bottom.
So now you were back to being a Demon flight instructor and LSO on shore duty in VF-121?
Yes, it was as though I never left the VF-121 pacemakers, often referred to as the space takers, because our aircraft availability was so low. We have a large number of mixed-type aircraft assigned with various modifications. Many were aging cast-offs, which had seen their day at sea and were difficult to maintain. There was also the relaxed attitude that goes with shore duty. During sea duty tours, we busted butt 24 hours a day, so there was a general expectation that the pace ashore was much slower to compensate. Unfortunately, that didn't apply to LSOs in RAG squadrons, which was often a more time-consuming grind than sea duty, with day and night FCLP and regular week-long carrier qualification deployments.
You mentioned FCLP, Field Carrier Landing Practice, before. Please explain it in more detail.
Runway 24 left had a simulated carrier deck outline and lighting 1,500 feet down the runway. The optical landing system was similar to carriers, and the LSO station was equipped with a radio. Pilots made 10 approaches during a 30-minute period, and as I recall, each pilot completed around 10-day and 10-night periods before going to the carrier. It was a very demanding challenge to day and night carrier qualify pilots with less than 50 hours flight time in the Demon or Phantom, especially for retreads, mid-grade, and senior pilots returning to sea duty from desk jobs. There had been a great improvement in the night carrier landing accident rate, but many retreads had fearful memories of prior experience in the days when night landings were not fully operational, depending on all-weather missions and pilot experience, which made retreads more difficult to train. On the other hand, the Nuggets, just out of flight training, eagerly accepted the challenge with much better attitudes because they didn't know better.
The power of positive thinking, Captain?
Absolutely. As Skipper Tiger Lewis told us in flight training, no one should be at the controls of an airplane, especially for night carrier landings, unless he would rather fly than eat. Fortunately, there were only a few who had been initially attracted to the glamour, flight pay, or career opportunities who, as they matured, realized the grim realities of the risks. When one demon driver admitted his fears to me, I asked why he had decided to become a naval aviator in the first place. His reply was that he saw that most admirals wore the Navy wings of gold. It worked for him. His ambition overcame fear, and he later made admiral.
I guess you can't argue with success then.
I can. I didn't want to be in the same squadron, much less the same airplane, with an officer focused on promotion as a prime objective, usually at the expense of everyone near him.
Were there many Nuggets who washed out in the RAG?
No, it was quite rare. The training command did its job well. Since carrier qualification was the primary and most demanding function of RAG training, the LSOs were the ones to bite the bullet in weeding out those who just couldn't cut it. We were conscientiously ruthless in these rare decisions because we took our responsibility very seriously not to pass along marginal aviators to fleet squadrons. Thankfully, we had very strong backing in those cases, even when prospective COs were grounded.
It seems that night carrier landings required superhuman flying ability.
Not so. Most naval aviators are average pilots. Their attitude and motivation, reinforced by excellent training and high standards, makes the difference.
So how do COs rate pilot ability in evaluations?
As one CO put it to his squadron pilots, no one else does what you do, and if you couldn't get aboard at night, you wouldn't be here. So Navy officer evaluations are based on leadership and management abilities in the performance of collateral duties. A very fair and effective system, I believe, since squadron time is limited and there's only so far to go with flying in a naval officer's career. If all we did was fly, there was little justification for being commissioned officers. Of my 31 years, only 15 were in the cockpit of operational airplanes. Still, I had more squadron time than most, since being an LSO kept me from the dreaded shipboard and staff tour assignments.
But didn't being an LSO 8 years make you a one-trick pony in Navy's eyes?
That was a commonly held view, but who knows? I like the way a personnel detailer put it in responding to a question about preferred career patterns. There are no good or bad jobs for junior officers. There are only good or bad fitness reports. So I just focused on being the best LSO I could be. It worked for me. Ron Hess, Tony Winslow, and I were a damned outstanding LSO team in VF 121, thankfully with 0 accidents in 3 years of constant carrier qualification operations with Demon and Phantom newbies. We averaged going aboard every other month for week-long landing qualification deployments, and we maintained day and night landing currency ourselves. The skipper, flight surgeon, and I were the first in the squadron to day-night carrier qualify in Phantoms. Besides LSO, I had 2 other demanding collateral duties. As the schedules officer, I was responsible for producing and implementing the daily flight schedule, complicated by individual pilot and RIO training requirements in 3 different type aircraft, as well as adjusting to aircraft and instructor availability. I was also the squadron coffee mess treasurer, which sounds pretty mundane. However, we did $1,200 a week in drinks and sandwiches until the Navy exchange folks complained about the competition and reined me in. As with many aspects of my life, I can't figure how I was fortunate enough to get through that time successfully and happily.
What did you think of the Phantom?
If higher and faster is an aviator's quest, the F-4 was the dream come true, especially for us old Demon drivers. In little more time than it took for a Demon to get off the ground, the Phantom could be at 40,000 feet. The airspeed advanced steadily like the second hand of a watch, all the way up to the 1,500 miles per hour limit. The speed limiting factor was high engine inlet air temperature, resulting from the shock wave compression. So, for the Mach 2.4 speed record, water was sprayed into the air inlets. Phantom set world altitude and speed records from sea level to over 100,000 feet. No operational airplane today flies higher or faster. Plus, F-4s were by far the highest quality airplane I ever flew. It was truly a Rolls-Royce class machine in every respect. What a thrill it was to pick up brand new F-4s at the McDonnell factory in St. Louis, where we were treated like VIPs with factory tours, including the Mercury capsule assembly area and first-class receptions, and then blast off in Afterburner for a test flight at a civilian airport with Mr. and Mrs. America watching.
Exciting business. You got paid for that too. What was it like to fly Phantoms?
Fighter pilots say speed is life, as is altitude advantage in aerial combat. But you know from riding the airlines that 40,000 feet at just under Mach 1 can be pretty boring. Though I could never understand those at window seats who close their shades so they can just read or sleep through the experience. Personally, I always enjoyed the view from any altitude. Same with speed, whether 40 knots or Mach 2. There isn't much sensation unless you're close to the ground or a cloud layer. Even then, you're quickly conditioned to speed. Truth is, fighters are nearly always flown in the same speed and altitude ranges as airliners, because fuel consumption is extremely high in Afterburner, and because window-shattering supersonic booms are illegal in most land areas. Having said all that, however, I'll give you a more complete and positive answer by describing our graduation flight in Phantoms, the Zoom climb to maximum altitude, for which we wore pressure suits. The adventure began with being fitted out for the suits and testing them in the pressure chamber. These were the same type single-piece full-pressure suits worn by the Mercury astronauts. Donning the suit required putting your legs and hips into the bottom half through a zippered opening diagonally across the front torso, and then curling up in the fetal position to get your arms in the sleeves and your head inside and up through the helmet ring attachment. Next, the gloves and boots were pulled on and zippered up to the suit to form a pressure seal. Finally, the individually fitted helmet went on your head and attached to the collar ring, which was on ball bearings, allowing the helmet to be freely turned from side to side. Oxygen was fed into the helmet through a regulator, which also sealed the faceplate and directed flow across the inside of the faceplate to keep it from fogging up. A system of external cables and pulleys on the suit kept your arms and legs from splaying out like a gingerbread man with the suit fully pressurized. To keep the suit bearable on the ground, a small portable suitcase-size air conditioning unit was carried until you strapped into the cockpit. Then came the live test of me in the suit in a special telephone booth-sized section of the pressure chamber to simulate an altitude of over 80,000 feet. A flight surgeon monitored the test from the outside through a thick 3-inch diameter viewing port. I sat on a small chair with nothing to do as the chamber pressure was reduced. The only item with me was a glass of water on a corner shelf for demonstration purposes. There was a small pressure gauge on the top left thigh of the suit, which read 3.5 pounds in the green with the suit fully pressurized. Although you'd think 3.5 pounds pressure was trivial, I assure you it was enough to stretch every inch of the suit drum tight, to the point of concern for whoever stitched this thing together. Even in a booth-sized chamber, the altitude ascent seemed to take forever. Then I noticed the reflection of my face on the inside of the faceplate, watched my eyes blink back at me, and feel my exhaled breath blow back in my face. The only sound was the soft psh of oxygen flow. I watched the water in the glass slowly coming to life with little jiggles, and contemplated the fact that as altitude increases, the boiling temperature of fluids, including blood, decreases. I look back at the suit pressure and into my blinking eyes as my blowback breath seems more exaggerated. The water now shows signs of boiling, and I reflected on the reason for wearing pressure suits at high altitudes. Without the suit or cabin pressure, blood boils and I die. I checked the suit pressure again. It's still in the green, but the suit fabric seems extremely taut. I looked into my face reflection, watched my eyes blink, and felt my breath. The water was boiling now. I realized that even though I have never before experienced any symptoms of claustrophobia, I will now appreciate what it is like for the rest of my life. Bless the Navy's penchant for developing torture devices. Finally, it was over. The altitude descended as the chamber pressure increased rapidly. The suit and I survived. The next test would be for real in the Zoom climb.
You've got my hands sweating from the chamber, Captain. I'm not sure I can handle the flight.
Strange that my most vivid memories of stress in aviation were created on the ground by the flight surgeons. So the flights weren't bad at all, mostly because there were more important things to do than watch your eyes blink. Once I donned the suit and was helped into the cockpit, I felt comfortable and at home. Although turning the helmet and looking down seemed awkward at first, I quickly fell into the routine of bringing the Phantom to life and completing the takeoff checklist. The flight profile was to climb to about 40,000 feet, where the air temp was lowest, as I recall, around 60 below, and accelerate to Mach 2. As I said, there is no particular sensation of speed. However, there was a tendency to squish down into the seat and hope something didn't depart the airplane. There was good reason for that concern. For one thing, Phantom wing and tail trailing edges were a sandwich of foil honeycomb material between aluminum outer sheets. At altitude, moisture trapped in the honeycomb would sometimes freeze, expand, and break away large chunks of wing or tail trailing surfaces. Fortunately, the loss was not noticeable in flight. Another, more noticeable event while accelerating at supersonic speed was the movement of the engine air inlet ramps. Briefly, the purpose of the ramp's movement was to position the shock wave on the forward edge of the engine air inlet ducts on both sides, just aft of the front seat. As airplanes accelerate at supersonic speeds, the shock wave angle becomes less acute. Phantom's ramps functioned outward from the fuselage to compensate for the changing shock wave angle. The necessity for this was that airflow behind the shock wave was subsonic, which is required at the engine. Otherwise, supersonic air into the engine would destroy it in a rather dramatic way. The thing about the Phantom ramps was that they tended to stick. They would really get your attention when they abruptly unstuck, and it was not clear to the pilot what had happened. Another consideration for scooching down in our seats was the very dramatic slow-motion 35mm film of a Phantom coming apart, attempting to set the low-altitude speed record in Operation Sageburner. Since Phantoms were aerodynamically unstable, they had a stability augmentation system. Normally, Phantoms flew okay with stab-aug off, so the Sageburner pilot elected to attempt the record with system inoperative. Bad decision. As I recall, the pilot entered the course at well over 600 knots indicated airspeed. In just a few close-up frames, the Phantom pitched slightly nose down and then nose up, whereupon both wings folded over the top and both engines departed the airplane side by side and continued down course straight and level, while the fuselage disintegrated in a ball of fire.
Wow, that somewhat detracts from the speed is life adage, doesn't it, Captain?
When you push the envelope that far, bad stuff can happen. That's the difference from flying airliners, though bus drivers do get occasional thrills as well, don't they? So, back to the zoom climb. The profile after accelerating to Mach 2 was to pull the nose up with 3 to 4 Gs into a vertical climb, then just ride it up as far as possible. An aerodynamic note appropriate to this and the Sageburner story is that a supersonic wing will not stall. For that reason, Phantoms had artificial feel applied to the stick in supersonic flight, and it took both hands pulling hard to get 3 Gs at Mach 2. I'll digress again now to tell the story of setting the altitude record as I heard it from the pilot Tiny Granning. As you might expect, Tiny was a big man who had been an All-American lineman on the Naval Academy football team. Tiny said the engineers were concerned about an expected enlarged engine afterburner flame pattern damaging the stabilator at high altitude, so they limited the amount of forward control stick movement. The engineers also told Tiny that because the limited controls would be relatively ineffective at slow speed and high altitude, he would have to start getting the nose over early. As told, Tiny started the nose over early, which worked okay, except that the nose just kept going and the Phantom pitch-poled end over end from 98,000 feet to 35,000 feet, where he was able to recover from a normal departure. He went on in later flights to set the record at over 100,000 feet.
Did that qualify Tiny as an astronaut then?
I hope so, but I don't know if that happened in Tiny's case. If you read books like The Right Stuff, you recall that in the beginning of the competing space programs, there was some distance between the test pilot and astronaut communities. But back to the zoom climb experience. Pulling the nose of an airplane straight up and keeping it there is a unique experience anytime. But passing 75,000 feet Heading for space in a pressure suit is a special thrill. The sky turns a deeper shade of blue until it begins to lose all color and becomes black. The Earth takes on a glow from its atmosphere, and the curvature of the horizon becomes more and more apparent. Things are happening in the cockpit, too. The engineers didn't figure on the lack of oxygen at 65,000 feet, causing the afterburners to blow out. Therefore, it was unnecessary to limit forward control stick movement. On the other hand, the engineers were correct about the engines overspeeding and overtemping at the top, and had reduced idle fuel flow to gain more engine time for the record attempts.
What altitude did you reach on these training flights?
I don't know. Pressure altimeters are unreliable at those heights, so unless there's calibrated ground tracking radar, it's a guess. My guess is that we probably topped out under 90,000. Oddly, it didn't much matter to us. I don't even recall looking at the altimeter. It was more important to monitor engine gauges and observe the spectacular skyscape. In fact, there really was no realistic operational necessity for pressure suits or the zoom climb, and I think the exercise was eventually dropped. The important thing was that it was an incredible experience, and I'm glad I was flying Phantoms in the era that did it.
How many times did you go?
Just once in the front seat, but I rode along in the back seat as an instructor several times.
Weren't you inspired to get into the space program?
I did make a feeble attempt to get into the astronaut program, but with 5 kids, being over 6 feet tall, not a test pilot, and with just a BA degree in psychology, there was zero opportunity for me in those days. Later, when they picked guys like me, I was over age.
How much F4 backseat time did you have, and how did you feel about it and the RIOs you flew with?
1/4 of my flight time in VF121 F4s was in the back seat, but I did not mind paying my dues for the front seat time. Remember, I initially trained as bombardier navigator in AJs, so I understood the crew perspective. As you know, I had mixed feelings about the need for F4 RIOs in our interceptor mission. I believe that bombardier navigators played a role as necessary as the pilots in the AJ mission. I flew with many Phantom RIOs, rarely the same one twice, but I remember only a few. It's not that I disliked having them aboard. It was simply that they were out of sight, out of mind, and I just forgot anyone else was in the airplane. They might as well have been surface-based intercept controllers. I might have felt differently if I had flown with a regularly assigned RIO, and we were in the same space like the 3-man crew in AJs, or the side-by-side seat arrangement of the F3D Druts.
Were there other aspects of flying Phantoms that impressed you initially?
In-flight refueling comes to mind. Plugging a probe into a small basket on the end of a short waving hose close into another airplane was challenging in any airplane, more so with Phantoms. F4s were 3 times heavier than the then current light attack A4 Skyhawks. At 220 knots refueling speed, the controls were relatively sloppy and unresponsive, a factor which made Phantoms poor close formation airplanes and cause for both the Blue Angels and Thunderbirds to stop using them. Also, the F4 refueling probe was above to the right and only slightly forward of the pilot in his peripheral vision, and well behind the bow wave of the airflow at the nose. The procedure was to stabilize position 10 or 15 feet back, with the probe lined up slightly above and to the right of the basket, then increase closing speed to the rate of a fast walk. As the basket passed the nose bow wave, it hopefully moved up and out the distance allowed to plug in. After plug-in, the hose was pushed in until the tanker's green fuel transfer light came on, and then backed off when transfer was complete. That's when all went well. However, there were several complicating factors. If the closure rate to the basket was too slow, the likely result was unsuccessfully trying to chase the waving basket and having to back off to start over. On the other hand, if the closure speed to the basket was too fast, it was possible for the probe to hit the basket off-center and flip it off, sometimes across the canopy, breaking it out, or else possibly going down the right engine intake. Another possible consequence of a fast closure rate was getting too close to the tanker and getting sucked into its slipstream. In that case, exacerbated by sloppy controls and high weight inertia, pilot-induced oscillation, PIO, might be induced, and in the effort to avoid collision with the tanker, might result in breaking away with the basket and hose connected to the Phantom instead of the tanker. It's an embarrassing experience to land with 80 feet of hose attached or with no canopy.
Did you have any of those experiences, Captain?
All of them except for landing with a busted canopy or a hose. My worst time was one night when I closed too fast, plugged in and flew into the tanker's slipstream. By the time I was able to slow down, back off, and safely get away, I had induced PIO so badly that I hit the stops with the control stick nose down as well as nose up. I was especially embarrassed to have the Air Wing flight surgeon in the back seat, but bless his heart, he didn't say a word about it. Al Balciunas certainly earned his flight pay that night. Later, he was also to earn hostile fire pay with me, but we'll get to that.
At least you remember his name.
Oh yes, better than any other RIO, for more reasons we'll get to. But that's all I have to say about VF-121. It was a good, enjoyable, rewarding, exciting, and successful tour.
There couldn't have been much time left for being a husband and father or for hobbies.
No, but as I recall, what there was of it was quality time. The kids were great, and Aurelie and I got along well. We continued with playing folk music, coffee houses, and folk festivals, as well as weekend family outings for picnics, trips to the mountains, Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, and weekend afternoons at the Model Yacht Basin. I had one notable accomplishment with model boats. The Argonauts got interested in pure speed, so a member designed and built a photocell timer for calculating straightaway speed on a measured 1/8 mile straightaway course on our Model Yacht Basin. Two-way averages were used to establish club speed records in various classes. My special interest was in the full-size, unlimited class, three-point hydroplane types, the fastest in all boat racing competition. The challenge with hydroplanes was that they virtually flew and were very unstable. Powered by 1,200 plus horsepower V12 aircraft engines, their hulls were airfoils, which actually lifted them just off the surface with only the lower blade of the propeller in the water as the sponsons skipped the tops of waves to add lateral stability, which was easily upset, especially in turns, by combinations of winds, waves, and the wakes of other boats. It was not uncommon for hydroplanes to roll or flip end over end, with fatal results to their drivers. The effects of wind and waves on small model boats were of course far more magnified. Consequently, no one had successfully modeled a hydroplane which would fly like the real thing.
So that's where you came in to develop an RC model hydroplane that could fly? How'd you do it?
I found a detailed article with the plans of a shovel nose, Miss Budweiser, as well as a Naval Research Lab article on supercavitating propellers developed for submerged submarines. The plans had all the information I needed, including center of gravity location and sponson angles. It took 3 months to design it, but only 2 weeks to build it. Since it was meant to be experimental, the model wasn't pretty. The hull didn't look much like the original, and everything about it was homemade and crude. But the hull airfoil sponson angles and CG were correct. The hull was only 32 inches long, 14 inches beam, and made of 1/16 and 1/8 inch aircraft plywood. It was well overpowered by a McCoy 60 model race car engine, run at over 13,000 revolutions per minute, adapted to this marine application with a homemade flywheel, exhaust pipe, throttle, drive shaft, propeller, and rudder. The radio controls were primitive, even by 60 standards, but by golly, it flew just like the real thing right off the building board. It handled beautifully, and I never had to change anything about it. What a thrill to see it come up on the step, hauling butt down the course with a 2-foot rooster tail behind. In 2 years of running it, the only mishaps resulted from radio failures, wave action, or high winds. Several times it flipped or swapped ends, but it proved to be indestructible.
So how fast did it go?
Well, I assure you it looked and sounded a whole lot faster than it was actually going, though the two-way average was just under 40 miles an hour. Still, it set the sanctioned Western Associated Modelers, WAM, unlimited speed record. Since WAM was the only official sanctioning organization for RC boat speed records, and I was in the top class, mine was in fact a world record for all RC boats, which remained unbroken for nearly 3 years.
How exciting! How did you follow that act?
I didn't. That was my last operating RC boat, and I retired from it.
Once you proved you can do it, move on, as Ron Hess said, Captain.
Partly so, but radios were improving enough to entice me back to model airplanes. Plus, the time flew by at phantom speed, and it was soon 1963, nearly time to go back to sea and to war. Model building was going on the back burner for a long while. A good place to end this chapter, I think. Let's start again after lunch, if you're up for it.
Let's do it.